Good afternoon, good morning, depending on where you are or when you're listening to this. So perhaps just to introduce myself, my name is Sam Gill. I'm a director at SLR Consulting, part of corporate citizenship, part of SLR now as well. And I work in the climate risk and resilience team, which is part of a wider ESG practice. So perhaps just to sort of set the scene a little bit today, I'll let my colleague Billy introduce herself when she comes on as well. Just to perhaps start off, if there are any questions that you have, feel free to put them in the chat and we'll come to those at the end. This is also part of a TCFD webinar series. So this is the first one today talking about climate scenarios and scenario narratives. We've got another one coming up, which is about financial modeling. We'll be doing another one a bit later on about risk integration. And then also on climate transition plans, which is a very hot topic. So lots of webinars coming up. Hopefully you can join us for them. But today's webinar, essentially what we want to do is talk about climate scenarios. And ultimately, it's really this question of how do we go about planning in the face of climate uncertainty? So that's what we're going to be talking about today. And we've really got three parts to the webinar. So the first one is just a recap on climate scenarios, what they are, how one can think about them. Then we'll talk a little bit about some of the recent developments that have been occurring in the market. And then finally, a little bit more practically speaking, how can one within an organization actually go about doing climate scenario analysis? So that's what we've got in store for you today, and let's jump into it. So the first point really is this, what are climate scenarios, just to make sure we're on the same page. And perhaps taking an even bigger step back is just sort of say, when are scenarios generally useful? It's very helpful as a planning tool. We see it used in the military, for example, all the time within government, particularly when we're trying to deal with outcomes or uncertainties where we don't really know what exactly is going to happen and when. But the purpose of the exercise is really to be doing the planning, and it's the value that comes from that planning that really is the thing to focus on here. So essentially, really, it's about describing a plausible but hypothetical path, which is going to lead to a particular outcome. So it's not really a forecast or a prediction per se, but it's more of a what if narrative. So designed to inform thinking, decision making, provoke conversations, and really to answer this question of what might be the potential implications for our strategy if X actually came to pass. So that's how I would say how to think about it. This is essentially what the TCFD says, and we find it a very useful exercise. So perhaps just to sort of visualize, what are we talking about when we think about different climate scenarios vis-a-vis climate change? Well, so this is from the last IPCC report, and essentially what it's talking about here on the left-hand side, on the left axis, we've got the carbon dioxide, and then over time, essentially looking at the different pathways and the resultant temperature that we end up with by the end of the century. And ultimately what we're talking about here is which trajectory is humanity going to follow over the next 70 years or so, and essentially where are we going to end up. So broadly speaking, just from a conceptual point of view, more emissions is going to lead to more physical risks building up in the system, more extreme weather events, more sea level rise, more of the chronic acute impacts. And conversely, the faster we transition to a zero carbon economy, the more we're going to have these transition risks. So whether that's climate policies or faster changes in technology, that's somewhat of a simplification. Ultimately, as I'm sure you're all seeing with your own eyes, we're already experiencing pretty extreme weather events, and depending on what jurisdiction you're in, you may also be seeing very rapid policies and other actions that are moving towards net zero. So the reality is we're very likely to end up with physical risks, even if we are decarbonizing pretty rapidly. And I think one thing to remember, and we'll come on to this a little bit more when we talk about some of the recent developments and critiques of scenarios, is that there's also a time lag in terms of how long it takes for the emissions that have been emitted to then lead to a corresponding warming in the atmosphere. So even if we completely stopped emitting all carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases tomorrow, we would still be feeling the effects of all of the warming that we've done over the last 10 years, into the next decade or so. So in conclusion, just before we go further, this is ultimately what we're talking about. It's what level of warming are we going to end up with, and what does that then mean for organizations and for society? So obviously the TCFD very much talks about things in terms of transition risks and physical risks, which is a very helpful way to think about this. So that's what we're talking about. And when we then think about this idea of grouping scenarios, one frame that can be helpful, which is used by the NGFS and also the likes of the Bank of England. So the NGFS being the Network for Greening the Financial System, a consortium of central banks. They essentially categorize scenarios into three buckets, if you like: orderly transition, disorderly transition, and then a hothouse world. And this description at the bottom sort of helps to explain what that means. So an orderly transition is where we're saying that there's very decisive global policy action to limit global warming in the early 2020s, or really it should have started at the beginning of the 2020s. So this is the scenario where essentially we're seeing more transition risks and a faster decarbonisation. Then we have the disorderly transition, where ultimately we do get concerted, well, it might not be concerted actually, it might be fragmented action from different parts of the world at different times to decarbonise. It does come, but ultimately it comes later. So late 2020s, early 2030s. And it might be in this scenario that you can imagine very aggressive policy measures. So this is where I like to think of, for example, a major financial center, somewhere like New York, gets hit by a major physical extreme weather event, and that suddenly leads to a complete policy shift where we get a very rapid introduction of, say, a very high carbon price. So it does come. When it comes, it's suddenly $200 a ton or something like that. And that in its own right causes more sorts of shocks. So this is what we call a disorderly transition. And then the hothouse world is essentially where you can either, I would think about it as either it's talking about the sort of high emissions pathway, or indeed it's pretty much what we have at the moment in terms of the policy commitments, which unfortunately don't really get us to any sort of safe level of global warming. One other thing, just mentioning the word safe there, I mean, ultimately we've never really jacked up the temperature of the planet this quickly before. So the idea that any of these levels are particularly safe is perhaps not something to hang on to. Rather, every additional increment of warming is increasing the risk of irreversible tipping points being triggered. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment as a bit of a limitation. Anyway, the point to make here is that having these three buckets is something we find very useful when working with our clients. And you can then put other models, whether that's from the sort of talk about the World Energy Outlook from the International Energy Agency, or the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or, for example, often people talk about a 1.5 degree or a 2 degree scenario. It can help to just put these into these buckets to think about them, and then decide which models you might want to draw upon, perhaps to make a particular argument or help develop thinking in a particular area. So perhaps just then to round off this section, so when we're thinking about these scenarios, a couple of things to keep in mind. So they should be plausible, credible, believable, and I think that's particularly important when you're working with stakeholders internally, to make sure that everyone can buy into that particular idea. They should be distinct. So if we just think back to that last slide, that's where having these different categories could be helpful. And each one essentially is describing a slightly different set of circumstances with a slightly different set of messages associated with it. There should also be an internal logic to the scenario. So different factors and relationships make sense within that scenario that's being described. It must be relevant. Ultimately, it needs to be relevant to you as an organization. So that's where actually developing your own scenarios of how exactly these macro impacts are going to come to the fore within your particular domain, it can be very useful. And ultimately, it should challenge some of the conventional wisdom, perhaps that might be existing within an organization. I mean, a common aspect of that we find may simply be the fact that there isn't a scenario that is particularly different to a business as usual trajectory, i.e. things are pretty much assumed to remain relatively similar to how they are today. So just by virtue of having one or two scenarios would indeed challenge thinking. I think, and just to round off on this, I mean, I think that the thing to just finish on here is that climate change is already impacting global systems. We expect that to happen more in the future as warming continues to increase. And so it really is very likely to permeate into pretty much all areas of the economy and the way businesses operate. So this really is an exercise that is certainly very useful to be doing to better plan and better adapt. I think those organizations that plan for the kinds of impacts that are coming from climate change will be much better placed compared to those who are not doing that sort of planning. So to talk about recent developments, and Billy, perhaps do you want to introduce yourself as well?
Hi all, I'm Billy Ryan. I'm also in the climate risk and resilience team working to support organisations to understand their climate risks. And yes, like Sam said, I'm going to speak through a few of the recent developments in this space and then talk about our approach to incorporating these. So this is quite a rapidly developing space. The TCFD does recommend that climate scenario analysis should be iterative. So wherever you are in this process, whether you're doing it for the first time or you have a quite mature approach, either way, you should be looking to incorporate any new insights. So a number of recent recommendations have been made for new iterations of climate scenario analysis, and we continually monitor these new developments so that we can incorporate these insights into our approach. Next slide, please. Great, so I'll just talk through three pieces of research or commentary that have come out recently in particular. Next slide. So the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries has brought out some commentary noting that many of the most severe impacts that we can expect from climate change aren't incorporated into some of the models that are being used for climate change scenario analysis. And the Earth also may, in fact, warm faster than is actually being predicted. They note that climate change is really complex, nuanced, and characterized by really deep uncertainty, and that it's essential that model users understand this. And so organizations should be using their own qualitative and quantitative scenario analysis alongside the regulatory models that are available, which Sam referred to earlier on there. So one approach that can be used to address some of these issues is kind of inverting scenario analysis and using a reverse stress test approach where you start with what you want to avoid and work backwards. So this is demonstrated in the figure there where it's showing 100% GDP loss and working back from that. So how this can be adapted for a client is modeling a business-specific ruin scenario. So for example, if a key commodity became unavailable or unaffordable, you could model that and work back from that ruin scenario. Next slide, please. So another piece has come out, which is actually still under discussion, where leading climate scientists are recommending that the climate models, the next generation of IPCC models, should evolve towards representative emissions pathways. And they have a particular focus on critical mitigation policy and adaptation needs in a quite short period over the next 5 to 10 years, and focus on meeting the Paris Agreement, the risks associated with carbon removal, the consequences of delaying enacting mitigation policy, and some guidance for adaptation. And a key point here is that the IPCC is kind of going in a direction where they're now aligning towards temperature and emissions pathways for that range of plausible scenarios that Sam spoke about. Next slide, please. So another piece of commentary that has come out is from the university's superannuation scheme in partnership with the University of Exeter. They've called for a real shift in climate scenario analysis to focus less on the climate itself and more on factors in politics, markets, and on those extreme weather events that have perhaps not been included as much as they should have. And a key theme across all these pieces of commentary is a real increased emphasis on the short term, because, as Sam said, you know, we're kind of already on that pathway to a disorderly transition. So it's really important that businesses are thinking about that next 5 to 10 years. Next slide, please.
Maybe,
And the
Billy, just
following.
before we move on,
Yeah, please
could
jump
I
in.
just add one point onto just that last section? So I think just picking up on the report that came out from the Institute of Actuaries, which would be the Emperor's New Climate Scenarios, which is a really good report. But I think just going back to this point about the sort of 100% damage or ruin scenario, where you're sort of imagining complete destruction of the economy. I think that the general point is that many of these scenarios are just not really factoring in the sort of really the reasonable upper worst case scenario. And one of the reasons that they give for that is this idea, essentially, that there's something called the equilibrium climate sensitivity, which is essentially thinking about the last time there was this much greenhouse gases in the atmosphere as there are today. So sort of cutting out all of the noise and just using that simple fact to ask, well, what happened last time greenhouse gas emissions were as high as they are today? And the sort of best estimate for where that places us is 3 degrees above pre-industrial levels, so today we're at about 1.2. And essentially, the sort of worst end of that estimate would be more like 4.5 degrees. And essentially, it's just really saying, well, actually, this isn't necessarily being reflected in the sorts of models that we're using, and therefore it might lead to a slightly more realistic conversation about where we could end up, and also the imperative for action if we are really facing what worst case scenario could be, which I know can be quite challenging. It's also somewhat terrifying, but yeah, that's essentially the points that are being made by the Institute of Actuaries. Sorry, Billy, I'll hand back.
No worries. Next slide. So we work with clients to kind of co-develop a scenario narrative that is specific to them, holding workshops in which we support them to do a kind of adapted PESEL analysis for their business for 3 different climate scenarios, and we hark back to the TCFD recommendations that Sam touched on about the scenarios being plausible, distinctive, consistent, relevant, and challenging, and that will look different for each client, right? So we start off by providing a bit of information about a range of scenarios, and then the rest is drawn out from discussion with the client. Next slide. And we pull this material together. Sorry,
Billy,
go on.
do you want to just maybe explain PESTEL, just for anyone who might not be so familiar?
Sure. So it stands for, well, the way that we do it is policy and legal, economic and markets, social and reputational, technological and environmental. So thinking about the developments in each of those spaces. So how might the government be regulating? Are you seeing lots of protests and perhaps legal challenges against businesses for not being seen to take action on climate change, this type of thing. Yeah, so drawing out that quite specific information for each client. Next slide. And so once we've drawn out this information, we pull that together to create three coherent scenario narratives that describe three plausible but different climate futures. We note down those assumptions that are made during scenario narrative development, and then that gives us the opportunity to then challenge them and make those assumptions clear in the final disclosure, because you can't avoid making assumptions. It's just about being transparent. Next slide. So you can see here, this is kind of a structure that is used in the interactive workshops where it draws out input from the client about their ideas of what might happen in each space across that PESEL analysis. Next slide. So I'll just show you a couple of example outputs of what this will result in. Next slide. So the tangible output is those bespoke scenario narratives, which will look a little bit like these images. And then the intangible output is the discussions that you have, the assumptions that are challenged, and the imagining that's done throughout this process. And we then use those scenario narratives to support scoring of each client's climate risks and opportunities, because we then have a bit of a richer understanding of your vulnerability and exposure to various risks. And on the next couple of slides are examples of what these scenario narratives can look like. So this is for a kind of orderly best case scenario. The next slide just pulls together a whole lot of different information, just providing a bit of context for a lot of the facts and figures that are shared. And then on to the next one. Great. So these scenario narratives can be used to support strategic discussions and decision making. So kind of testing your business's strategy against these narratives to question whether your strategy is resilient to how climate change could pan out, or whether you need to make some adjustments. So it can also be used to kind of upskill and educate within an organization, and yeah, like I said, planning for climate resilience. And then finally, a public-facing version can serve as a climate disclosure in line with the TCFD or ISSB standards, or whichever standard you might be subject to. There are so many more developing. And so this process makes the best of the fact that clients know their business the best. It draws out all that really specific information, that rich knowledge that you have, and then we as external consultants are there to be a bit of a fresh pair of eyes, facilitate you through that process, and also to challenge those assumptions, prevent that groupthink that the TCFD warns against. Sam, do you have anything to add there? Otherwise, we can move on to taking some questions.
Yeah, sure. Let me maybe just add a couple of just sort of further reflections. I think the so what I think we've observed as best practice, but also found to be really useful with the clients that we're working with, is essentially developing these very specific narratives relevant to the organization. So using the frame from the Network for Greening the Financial System of having three broad scenario buckets: orderly, disorderly, hothouse world, then taking the models that we think are most relevant to help inform our thinking, and then working with the client in a iterative process. So I think there was a quote from one of the reports that was sort of talking about the best practice. I think it might have been the one of the latest best practice reports, but essentially saying, actually it's not so useful having the consultants come in and sort of do all of the work. It's actually those discussions that happen, in the workshops with different stakeholders from different parts of the business who don't always get to come together and think about these issues. So I think that's really where we've tried to move our process is more of an iterative process where we're, for example, really getting the business to think about how the politics, the economics, the situation in the markets, the legal situation is going to evolve under different scenarios. So we're often using tools like Mural to be able to facilitate online collaborative workshops with post-its. That's also something we do in person as well. But obviously, it's not always practical to travel, and sometimes you do actually get more engagement from people if everyone is able to be heard in a workshop through the fact that it's in written form. But anyway, so bringing together the sort of the context to then help evolve what are those climate risks and opportunities. That's obviously the key aspect of the TCFD. And then crucially, how could they change under these different set of scenarios and circumstances? So it's that dialogue that happens usually in workshops and then moving towards an output that is visual as well as textual. And I think that's also one of the ways that we're using to get around the fact that not everything can be quantified. There's often a lot of challenges with these assumptions in the models. That's essentially what most of the critiques are saying. And so actually it's about sort of moving beyond just getting stuck at the data or a lack of data and sort of saying, well, how can we actually think through this in a bit more of a logical way that might be appropriate to the business? So thinking about it a little bit more in terms of an if statement. So if X were to occur, or if the price were to get to this point, what kind of decision making might need to occur within the organization. So trying to make these scenarios and this exercise as useful as possible to an organization so that it can start planning a bit more effectively. And this is something that we're seeing in some of the other work that we're doing around climate change risk assessments, for example, where there's a move towards using something called dynamic adaptive pathways, where essentially an organization, so if we imagine an organization that might be threatened by sea level, it might be that when you get to a particular level of the sea having risen, that certain decisions might come into effect. Are you going to be investing in additional flood defenses or seawalls? Or actually, when it gets to a certain level, are we now going to be putting into practice our plan, which is about managed retreat? So essentially, starting to think a little bit about what are those stage gates that trigger other types of plan that might need to come into effect. Anyway, so I'll stop there. If anyone has any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. And if we don't get to them today because we've run out of time, then we'll follow up directly and get back to you. Are there any specific questions that have come up that we need to answer? I think this might be one question about the pace of warming. So just one thing that I think can be a little bit confusing about where exactly we're going to get to in terms of temperature rise. And I think one of the reasons why it can be a bit misleading to talk about 1 degree or 2 degrees is that if you remember back to the graphs we showed with the temperature increase, actually often we're looking at emissions peaking or temperature peaking, and then we see a decline afterwards. So this is why framing climate scenarios more in terms of the not just emissions and not just temperature, but more that policy trajectory. Are we going to see rapid moves away from high carbon industries, or is that going to be delayed? For example, can be a useful way to deal with that. So I hope that answers that question. Are there any others? Conscious we only have a minute left. Perhaps maybe, Billy, do you want to maybe just give the dates for the next webinars?
One moment. So I think the next one is in a fortnight. Sorry, one second. I've lost those dates, so we'll send those out in the follow-up from the workshop. There is one last question, just about how much engagement and input is required from the client for this process. Sam, I'm not sure if you have thoughts on that, otherwise I can answer.
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
So I mean, as much as possible, but on a normal process, we tailor it to the client, but looking at about 6 hours worth of workshops, but having a core TCFD working group that are available to be in communication with us is the best approach, but it is tailored depending on how much capacity the client has and what your needs are. Do you have anything else to add there,
Yeah.
Sam, before we wrap up?
Yeah, maybe just to add, I think, we tend to try to organize multiple workshops, and often we find that there's a sort of core climate task force, sort of pulling from different parts of the business. So it's good to sort of bring in typically, people from risk, people from finance, ideally having some sort of C-level sponsor involved is often really helpful. And then it's somewhat dependent on the business who the most relevant people would be. But typically we'd say a minimum something like 3 workshops, and then often there's other engagements as well. But yeah, it's something we tailor to meet the needs of the organization depending on how much capacity they have. I think we're out of time. Just to say, my contact details are here. If you want to email us, if you have any questions, then feel free to do so. Otherwise, thank you very much for joining today. And yeah, hopefully that was useful.